Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Accident and emergency departments in England have recorded their worst performance since current records began in 2004. 1 in 6 patients waited longer than the 4-hour target in October, and the target for starting cancer treatment was missed for the 46th month in a row. The total number of people waiting for routine operations is now nearly 4.5 million. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn described the figures as disgraceful and blamed the problems on a lack of staff and funding. But the Prime Minister said they were a result of the huge demand being placed on the National Health Service. Here's our health editor, Hugh Pym.
That was when I thought, right, OK, something's not right.
Donald, who was 84, died after sliding off a hospital trolley. He'd been waiting 6 hours in A&E.
From 8:15 up until the time he died, nobody came to see him. No pain relief was offered.
His daughter, who's a former nurse, said he might still be alive if calls for help had been acted on.
You can appreciate how busy nurses are, how busy A&E can get. However, come sort of 10, half 10, when I was speaking to nurses and a doctor to say that my dad needs to be seen, and I wasn't listened to, I was very angry.
The hospital said it offered sincere sympathies to Donald's family and was investigating the matter thoroughly. The NHS is under intense pressure as patient numbers rise year by year. In October 2014, there were just under 470,000 emergency hospital admissions, but last month there were more than 560,000. 5 years ago, around 105,000 had to wait more than 4 hours in A&E. Last month, the figure was around 320,000 patients. Boris Johnson was challenged on the declining performance of the NHS.
This is basically caused by the huge demand that there is on the NHS, and that's why now, in the last 3 months, we have done the biggest investment in the NHS in modern times.
But other parties attacked the government's record.
The worst performance ever in our A&E departments. I mean, so many patients will be languishing on trolleys, waiting longer and longer and longer for treatment and care in our overcrowded hospitals. I mean, this comes after a decade of cuts in our health services.
I'm appalled by these figures today. They are the worst figures on record. It's devastating for patients that need help and support and treatment. It's devastating for those people that work in our health service.
In England, 83.6% of patients were treated or assessed in A&E within 4 hours in October. For the rest of the UK, the latest figures are for September. In Scotland, the level was 89.3% in that month. In Wales, the number was lower at 75%. In Northern Ireland, just 59.6% were treated or assessed in 4 hours in major A&E units. There were similar pressures on health services across the UK. They're illustrated by the experience of Jill, aged 88, who has dementia. She was on a trolley in A&E for 6 hours, and her family say they witnessed severe stress in the hospital.
It was bedlam. There was trolleys in the corridors, there was trolleys in doorways. They were bringing trolleys in, they were moving your trolley and pushing you further and further and further that way. You fit in 2 more people in that way. If they were moving a trolley, they had to move trolleys out of the way to get trolleys by.
Her family say Jill should never have been sent to A&E, and she was let down by local community care. The hospitals apologised but said a significant increase in the number of very poorly patients meant services were under considerable pressure.
Well, Hugh is with me now, and just to be clear, those figures are from October, so winter hadn't even set in. The fear must be that it can only get worse.
Yes, Sophie, we haven't had any serious winter weather. We haven't had a flu season, and look what's already happening out there in the system. I should say NHS staff are working flat out to try and deliver the patient care they want to, but faced with this rising demand, it's really, really difficult to hit these targets. I think there are a couple of issues which you could say haven't really been fully addressed in this election campaign. One of them is how much money does the NHS really need to keep up with demand and transform itself to do more care in the community so people don't need to end up in hospital. The other thing is workforce. Where is the future supply of nurses and doctors going to come from at the time of unfilled posts? And there is a problem at the moment on that, a complex pension problem, which means some senior doctors don't want to work extra shifts to help clear waiting times because they say it's all eaten up in tax. a problem the NHS really doesn't need right now.
Hugh Pym, thank you.
Well, let's go straight into these figures. They've just come out this morning. They are not good news for the government. They aren't good news if you're an NHS patient. Let's take the A&E patients. They're meant, 95% of them are meant to be admitted or transferred within 4 hours. The true figure has come out now is 83.6%. Let me give you one more. The cancer patients figure, 76.9% of cancer patients don't start their treatment in under 62 days. 85% are meant to do that, but it's 76.9%. These are pretty difficult figures. I think we've got the BBC's health editor, Hugh Pym, is there. Let's go straight to him. Hugh, what's your reaction to these figures, particularly coming out as an election campaign is getting underway?
Well, Andrew, we'd heard reports in October of some hospitals being under extreme pressure, that winter had come early, that A&E units were very, very full. This was ahead of the normal cold weather and flu, which comes later in the year. But these figures, I think, even so, were pretty surprising. That dropped to 83.6% of patients treated or assessed within 4 hours in English A&E units, down from 89% in the same month, October last year. And in fact, if you look at all those targets that you mentioned there, also there's one for routine surgery, 18 weeks to wait for your operation. Overall, hospitals had their lowest performance in England really since records began 10 years or so ago. So it is a very difficult situation for the NHS, and I think the message that's coming out of these figures and from people who work there and the think tanks is the parties are pledging more money, but it needs something more significant, a workforce plan, 100,000 vacancies or more in the NHS in England, and also a solution to this pensions issue, this tax on pensions. Complicated, but for highly paid consultants it's resulted in tax bills, which means they say they don't want to come in and do an extra day's work on the Saturday to help clear the waiting list because it all goes in tax. So a number of questions for all the parties here.
All right, Hugh Pym, thank you very much for that. Joe Tanner, this shows you what can come and bite you in an election campaign and you can't control. An election that's meant to be about Brexit, but here we are looking at these terrible target figures.
Yeah, and actually I think one of the worst things has been that this election is about Brexit, and it should be about the issues that face people day in, day out. I had to take my son to A&E only in the last few weeks, and we sat and waited for hours to be seen. And I was in an overcrowded hospital with, you know, young babies that were very sick, needing to be seen. This probably isn't a massive surprise for members of the public who've actually had to go and sit in A&E because, let's face it, we've spent so long talking about Brexit. We haven't dealt with half the challenges that the country faces, one of those being the NHS, things like adult social care, which has also put a massive strain on the system. But these things have got to be dealt with.
You see, Laura, when you look at these figures, put aside just for a second that they're not hitting the targets. Even the targets themselves are not that great. The target is that 85% of people who are diagnosed with cancer should receive treatment in 62 days. In other words, you're told you've got cancer and we'll get round to you in 62 days. Now, not even that target is being met, but even the target itself is not great for an advanced, prosperous democracy.
No, and these figures coming out now is a disaster for the Conservative Party. Labour have wanted to talk about the NHS because they know they poll well with the public on this issue. People tend to trust the Tories more with the economy, Labour with the NHS.
The recent poll suggested Mr Johnson was actually polling better on the NHS than Mr Corbyn,
yeah,
which would be a first.
Which would be a first, and so this is just the last thing that they want to happen. This is really bad news for the Conservatives.
The last poll I saw on that, they pulled level, which is still
unusual.
If you're Conservative Prime Minister, that's an advantage. You're playing Labour to a draw. But those figures, I mean, they are grim, as you say. Treatment for cancer, that's nearly 9 weeks you would have to wait, worrying, fretting as the cancer develops before you start your treatment. But they are grim, and I'm reminded of events, dear boy events.
And what's the wait time for those people outside of that target?
There is an urgent referral target as well, that if it's something really urgent, it can start well before. But even that target's been missed.
But you think cancer would be an urgent referral, wouldn't you?
Yes, in general. But I suppose, I mean, to be diagnosed with that, whatever it is a terrifying thing. But obviously there are degrees that you need to be dealt. But even the speedy ones have been dealt right. Now, I hear you asking what's been the Conservative reaction to this. Well, let me tell you. Here, Matt Hancock, he's the Health Secretary. He says these figures show just how important it is that we stop Jeremy Corbyn. I'll just let that hang there for a minute. That's his response. And then he goes on to say, with rising demand and with dedicated staff already working exceptionally hard, the last thing our NHS can afford is Labour's plans for a 4-day week and uncontrolled and unlimited immigration. In other words, he's not actually dealing with the figures itself. I've just been told this isn't Mr Hancock, it's Conservative Party, but for the purpose of an election campaign, it's pretty much the same thing there. So it's Mr Corbyn that we have to avoid because of this. Isn't the truth, Joe Tanner, on this, that whatever macroeconomic reasons may have justified it, over the past 9 years, spending on health every year has only been about 1.5% in real terms, whereas the average since it was founded in the late 40s is about 3.5, 3.6%. That's sometimes been higher, but that's the average. And these are the inevitable consequences of such small increases in the budget.
Yeah, and I think the finances are a massive issue. But again, like many other public services, there are also issues around how they work, how they function, the timing of how they function and how they interact with other systems. There are fundamental pressures on the NHS which are actually not directly the NHS's fault. And sometimes it's about how other parts of the system work. So when you have things like adult social care that fails so badly, you end up with patients that are in beds that, they shouldn't be in hospital. They should actually be being dealt with somewhere else. We've all experienced that, where we've walked into a hospital and realised that someone needs genuine care that is not hospital related. It's actually something completely different.
That is true, but the squeeze has been the tightest in the history of the NHS. You squeeze the finances of the NHS for 9 years like that, you will have, sadly, an impact like that. Yeah. The Conservative proposals, the spending proposals, will be the second tightest squeeze in the history of the NHS over any comparable period. Labour's will be above the trend rate, I think it's 3.7, 4.3, won't match the 6% of the Blair and the Brown
Actually
era.
lower than it was under Alec Douglas-Hume.
Yep, but you can see...
He used to be Prime Minister, Not
very long, was
younger
he?
viewers start here.
But I
can see Laura looking.
But you can see, I'm just reminded now of the slogan, you only used it briefly as an incumbent Prime Minister, but Boris Johnson said Britain deserves better. People will feel that on the NHS. I
want to move on, but just, Laura, I want to put a point to you. We had Jonathan Ashworth in the studio last night, the Shadow Health Secretary. It seemed clear to me that what he was thinking, even if he didn't say it outright, is you can have a 4-day working week in 10 years' time, or you can fund the health service properly. You can't do both.
Yeah, I mean, Labour's position yesterday seemed very confused as to whether or not they would immediately introduce a 4-day week. And understandably, people reacted, well, it's under enormous strain. How is that possible? It's not possible. And the fact they're confused actually really doesn't help them when they do need to be talking about the NHS. The fact that these figures come out shows why having a Christmas election was such a gamble for the Tories. We predicted this might happen, and it has. Labour need to make sure their message is clear on this. They can't afford to be putting out these confused messages that they did yesterday.
OK, that's health. It's not the last we'll hear of it.
Well, the NHS was already high up the list of election issues, but the data released today has shown just how big a point of contention this will be as the election campaign runs on. All the major parties took the opportunity to say they are the ones to be trusted on turning the NHS around. But with waiting times at their absolute worst, they all face a difficult task convincing voters. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald reports.
A winter that staff say has been year-round. Crowded hospitals even through the summer, historically long waits for treatment. And today, the unwelcome headline figure that revealed that October had the worst ever A&E performance since the target was introduced in 2004.
Where we think the problem is that the NHS is essentially underfunded and it's understaffed. So there are at least 40,000 nursing vacancies at the moment. We know that GP numbers are far below where we need them to be if we're going to be able to deliver the care that we want to be able to deliver. And to do that, we also need more money for the NHS.
NHS England's performance monthly data shows that fewer than 84% of patients who arrived at A&E were treated or admitted in 4 hours. The target is 95%. And more than 720 patients waited over 12 hours for a bed in October. That was a 60% increase from September. It was always anticipated that these figures were going to be bad. The problem, of course, is that they're in the middle of a general election. Yet what this data doesn't show you is the pain and suffering that some of these patients have to go through as they wait for their operations or sit on those chairs in A&E. Catherine Manning, who has rheumatoid arthritis, spent 6 months waiting for a hip replacement.
Why were you so desperate? Because it hurts. The pain and the fatigue. I was falling over on a regular basis. Almost daily I was falling. I needed help just to get dressed in the morning, and just being a mum, I couldn't do the general things that I just wanted to do with my children, just like going out, school run, because of the pain.
Was it hell?
Yeah. And I don't ever want to go through that again.
NHS England is currently reviewing all the targets, possibly scrapping some of them. But today the Royal College of Surgeons and the charity Versus Arthritis wrote to the 3 main party leaders, urging them not to abandon the one for 18-week planned and elective surgery.
They plan with their surgeon for a long time, for many years, when is exactly the right time to have the operation. And often they're desperate because of the pain. For that to be snatched away from you just when you think you're going to have the operation as a massive psychological blow. But also we know that if you delay a joint replacement, it can also affect your physical health.
The Conservatives actually wanted today to be about immigration, but it was the NHS that dominated.
What these figures show is the huge pressure that there is on the NHS caused by demand. And that's why we're making colossal investments now in the NHS. Just since I've been Prime Minister, £34 billion programme.
Yet immigration and the NHS are linked, not least because it's reliant on bringing in overseas staff to fill the gaps.
The NHS now has 40,000 nurse vacancies, has the longest waiting times in history, has the longest queues for A&E departments, and very large numbers of people waiting for operations, often because of staff shortages brought about by us not recruiting enough overseas doctors or nurses. We've got to be realistic about the needs of our economy for bringing workers in, skilled workers in to help us.
What was striking about today's figures was how widespread the problems were. 23 trusts had patients waiting more than 12 hours on trolleys. The highest numbers were in Stockport with 63 patients, Cornwall with 59 and Lewisham with 52. Yesterday, Labour outlined its plans for England's NHS, pledging £6 billion more than is currently promised by the Conservatives, though they and the Lib Dems have yet to unveil their health manifestos. But whatever money comes post-election, it is too late now to avert what is likely to be one of the harshest winters in recent times for the health service.
Well, we did ask for an interview with Matt Hancock, the Health and Social Care Secretary, or one of his junior ministers, but no one was available. Joining us now from Leicester is the Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary for Labour, John Ashworth. How quickly would a Labour government meet these targets once again?
Well, can I just say, isn't it absolutely heartbreaking what we're hearing about the state of the NHS under the Conservatives? The worst A&E performance on record, and so many people, often elderly people, often people confused, sometimes with dementia, languishing on trolleys for hours and hours and hours in busy, overcrowded hospital corridors. I mean, this is heartbreaking stuff.
But when would you turn it around?
We've got to really turn this around. Well, look, you know, we're going to put an extra £26 billion into the National Health Service, or on the calculation that Boris Johnson prefers to use, it would be £40 billion extra under Labour. We want to see that 18-week target, which the Royal College of Surgeons and others in your package were saying should be kept. We want to keep that target, and we want to see patients getting their operations on time. I'm not going to lie
attempt, John Ashworth.
or kid the
I've
British.
asked you, when will you hit these targets? When can you tell voters,
I would
we'll
hope
get
that
this sorted out?
Because I'm not going to I'm not going to kid voters. I'm not going to lie to voters. It's going to take some time to turn this juggernaut around. I'm going to be honest with voters on that, because after 10 years, a decade now, of cutbacks, cutting over 15,000 beds, I don't think the voters would believe me if I said, don't worry, it'll all be turned round on December the 13th if you elect a Labour government. I'm not going to lie to people. After 10 years of driving the NHS into the ground, it's going to take time to turn this around. But Labour governments have done this in the past. We inherited record waiting lists in 1997, and of course, by the time we left office, we had some of the highest satisfaction ratings on record and the lowest waiting lists on record.
It's about how now, isn't it? But both you and the Conservatives are pledging a lot more money for the NHS. You're pledging a bit more. And the question is how you're going to do it. You are also saying NHS staff will move to a 4-day week over time.
No, we're not saying that.
How much will that cost?
We're not saying that.
Well, that's what the Shadow Chancellor said. Over 10 years, the NHS staff will also be part of his target to reduce working hours to 32 hours a week. That's going to have a cost for the NHS, isn't it?
That is not. We are not imposing a mandatory 4-day week.
I didn't say
on
that.
the NHS. Just let me explain this. Well, let me just explain the position on this, because I know the Conservatives are trying to make out there'll be a 4-day week in the NHS. It's utter nonsense. It's actually a lie from Matt Hancock, I'm afraid. I don't like using that word, but it's actually a lie from Matt Hancock. What John McDonnell is talking about is that over time, seeing if we can, the national average of wage hours in the economy, which is around 37 hours at the moment, whether we can bring that national average down across the whole economy. Obviously, when you're calculating the national average of working hours in the UK economy, the hours worked in the NHS will be part of those calculations. That is a different position from imposing upon the NHS, or indeed any sector in the economy,
but obviously,
a mandatory
some NHS
4-day
staff
week.
will have their hours reduced if they want to, won't they, over a period of time? I mean, it would be absurd to exclude 1 million workers in the United Kingdom from this new target of yours. So, I mean, it will affect some NHS staff, and that will have a cost. Have you factored that in, is what I'm saying?
If in 10 years' time, if productivity is such, and advances in automation and technology are such, that when we go into negotiations with staff trade unions, and staff trade unions say, actually, the current contracted 37.5 hours we think could change, then that is something that any responsible employer would negotiate with staff, as happens at the moment, of course, in negotiating with NHS trade union staff about their terms and conditions.
Okay.
But at the moment in the NHS, you've actually got staff working beyond their 37.5 hours under the Conservatives, because the NHS has been pushed to the brink.
Look,
but this suggestion, this allegation that there'll be a mandatory 4-day week in the NHS.
Well, I haven't said that at all.
Nonsense.
So you're kind of denying
I know you've not
something
said
that other people may have said.
You're not.
Just finally, I mean,
yes, I'm denying what Matt Hancock has suggested.
Look, one of the biggest challenges, as you know, is recruiting staff. There are 100,000 staff vacancies in the NHS.
Yes.
And a lot of people are going to have to come in from abroad to fill those jobs. Are you going to do anything to make it easier for people from other countries to come in and staff the NHS as they have historically?
Yes, I am. I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to bring back a training bursary for nurses and midwives and allied health professionals. So people in Bury and Bolton and Mansfield who want to train to be a nurse or a midwife, they'll be given the opportunity to train and come and work in our NHS. But I'm not going to say to hospitals who believe that if they found a surgeon or a nurse from abroad, if they believe that surgeon or nurse is qualified enough to care for our sick and our elderly, I don't think we should put hindrances in their way. So I believe the NHS should be able to recruit internationally, and under a Labour government, they will be able to recruit internationally.
Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Krishnan. Well, joining me now is Dr. Chan Nagpal, Chair of the British Medical Association. Thanks very much for joining us. You heard there from the Shadow Health Secretary. We heard from the Prime Minister earlier saying that the pressure is actually caused by demand. What's the truth here?
I think it's really unfair to be blaming demand or patients about the pressures in the NHS. The simple fact is we simply don't have the infrastructure compared to other leading European nations. We are tens of thousands of beds short compared to France and Germany. They have twice as many. We have far too few doctors. We We have far too few social care facilities. GPs in the UK see patients at the shortest intervals in the whole of Europe at 10 minutes. So we actually don't have the system, the infrastructure, the people to provide the care that the public need. So it's not fair to blame it on patients or demand.
Can you give us a sense of what it's actually like for your members in these hospitals having to make decisions every day?
So doctors want to do their best for their patients, and it's actually really quite demoralising for doctors to be unable to provide patients with the care they want. So if you're actually working in a hospital setting, to actually see patients waiting 12 hours in a trolley is actually, you know, it goes against everything we stand for and what we want to do. And there are 30,000 more patients waiting in trolleys now compared to this time last year. So the situation is really worse than we've ever seen before. Similarly, in the community, GPs are seeing patients who should be in hospital, who should be provided with proper care. They want to have the facilities and time. They cannot do so. We also have problems in social care. 5,000 patients are occupying beds where if we had these facilities for them to be cared for in the community, they could vacate. So it's actually a complete whole system pressure that's resulted in what we're seeing at the moment.
I mean, both the major political parties are pledging to spend more cash. Is that enough? Do you think our political leaders have got a grasp of what's going on?
I think if we just hear headline figures. What we need to understand, and everyone needs to be hearing from politicians about how they will actually spend that money, how that will translate into differences. So, in fact, if we know that we need 10,000 more doctors, how will that be achieved? Just saying that we'll put more money in and somehow something will be magicked up isn't the way to run the health service. The other thing is this isn't a winter crisis, because we've been hearing about the BMA identified 2 years ago. What we actually have is an all-year crisis. We're seeing summers that actually have greater waits than previous winters. So we need to fix the NHS, not just fix winter.
OK, just very quickly, how long would it take realistically to turn this around?
Well, it's going to take several years because we've had 10 years of underinvestment, austerity. But what we can do, some immediate measures, and I'll just give you one. Doctors at the moment are being prevented from working extra hours. Many are actually not leaving the health service because of some punitive tax rules. We need to just scrap those. We need to take away the barriers that prevent doctors from overseas coming to work here. And there are charges that we incur for them to come and work here. So there are things that can be done immediately, as well as longer term.
A lot more to talk about. Going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming in. Krishnan.
Well, the middle of an election campaign is not the best of times for a government to have to defend the worst statistics ever on NHS waiting times, especially when you're a Conservative government and your main Labour opposition are making it their key election issue. That was the position the Prime Minister found himself in today. Official figures for England show targets for starting cancer treatment are being missed. A&E waiting times are the worst on record, and nearly 4.5 million people are waiting for routine operations.
Elections are often full of statistics, but today's are the worst since records began. And any sign that the NHS is heading for a winter crisis means this quickly becomes a political one. Emma Driver only has one vote, but stories like hers may influence others. Her 84-year-old father died after waiting for 6 hours on a hospital trolley.
Come 12:30 a.m. when my dad vomited in the corridor, and I shouted for help and not one person came. I sat him up, he slid off the trolley and onto the floor with members of the public looking. And when I was shouting then, it was only then that 2 nurses very reluctantly wanted to help me.
In England, 95% of A&E patients are supposed to be dealt with within 4 hours, but last month less than 84% were, a record low. For cancer patients, the aim is to see 85% within 62 days. Only 77% were seen that quickly, with targets for routine treatment missed too.
This is your steering wheel.
So yet again, the Prime Minister is struggling to set the course for this election On his trip to Bristol Port, he accepted his part in steering the NHS towards its worst performance.
Do you take responsibility for that?
Of course, but you've got to recognise, Paul, that what we're facing is huge demand now in the NHS, and that is why we're now responding with since this government's been in, we've got the biggest investment in the NHS in modern times.
Never mind your future promises, voters will also judge you on your past record. Do you think this is a record to be proud of?
Well, I think that if I look at what the NHS is achieving, then yes, I am immensely proud of the NHS and its achievements.
You're proud of these waiting times?
Over the lifetime of the government, and yes, but if you say, can we do better, must we do better, should we be investing more? Yes, of course.
At the closest A&E to his visit, today we found waits of up to 6.5 hours, with voters divided over who'd improve things.
Who do you trust to look after the NHS?
Conservatives.
Do you? Why is that?
I think they make the better job of it overall.
Do you think the NHS will help determine who you vote for in this election?
I think it will for a lot of people, yeah, definitely. Because if people want to save the NHS, they're going to go for the other parties that want to save it. But I don't think the Tories do, to be fair. I think they'd rather sell it off, to be honest.
And in the battle for voters, bad figures are proving good politics.
It is disgraceful, and it is a problem of the lack of staff and the lack of funding for it. So a Labour government will increase NHS funding.
People will be rightly concerned as we approach winter. It's clear that the NHS is not safe in the Conservative Party's hands.
So again in this election, the Prime Minister's path is proving precarious. Paul Brand, News at 10. Bristol.
These monthly NHS figures for England are the last before the election, and they make for grim reading. Key targets for cancer, hospital care and A&E have been missed for over 3 years, with delays for hospital care and delays in A&E hitting the highest levels since both targets were introduced. The language that's followed from politicians was entirely predictable. Jeremy Corbyn called it disgusting. The Liberal Democrats said the Tories had a shameful record. Boris Johnson blames the huge demand from the profession too. The Society of Acute Medicine said the system was imploding. The BMA, the NHS is facing a catastrophe. Well, targets have been missed too in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and all the parties are promising to increase the NHS budget. But is it really all about trying to outbid each other, or do we need to rethink how we run the whole service radically? Well, we're going to discuss all that in a minute. But first, here's James Clayton.
Really, emergency departments are currently at the absolute limit of what they can work with.
Dr. Catherine Henderson is the president of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. This is what she describes happening in the NHS right now.
They're running wards in corridors, and they're aware that they're not providing the standard of care that they would like to be providing. There are difficulties offloading ambulances and getting patients into the department, and there are difficulties getting patients out of the department, known as exit block. So patients are ending up staying on trolleys in corridors, waiting to go up to a ward bed.
What's so eye-catching about these stats is how consistently bad they are. 4.4 million patients on the hospital waiting list at the end of September, the highest number ever. 84% of A&E patients treated or admitted within 4 hours in October. Once again, the worst performance seen since the target began in 2004. And 77% of cancer patients starting treatment within 62 days, way below the 85% target. The Prime Minister today was quick to place the blame elsewhere.
What we're facing is huge demand now in the NHS, and that is why we're now responding with since this government's been in, we've got the biggest investment in the NHS in modern times.
Crucially, demand rises in the winter, which hasn't actually begun yet.
What is scary about these results is that this is just the beginning of winter. We haven't seen the flu season really get going. So we're in real fear of what's going to happen in the weeks ahead.
Those fears will also be felt in Conservative campaign headquarters. There are exactly 4 weeks to go until the country goes to the polls.
The Conservatives want to turn this election into a Brexit election. But questions about the single market, about the customs union, would the withdrawal agreements really be good for business? Those are quite cerebral questions. Whether or not you'd be looked after well if you were sick in hospital is a much more tangible issue for voters.
I don't think it's inevitable that this election will be the Brexit election.
When you ask people what's the most important issue facing the country, the largest numbers say Brexit. But when you ask people what's the most important issue facing you and your family, it's health that comes top, ahead of Brexit and the economy and immigration and other things. And so it could be that this election turns on health policy as much, if not more so, than Brexit. And that's important because the NHS always rises in importance in winter months. And there are often bad stories emerging as a result of the cold. This year could be no exception.
24 hours to save our National Health Service.
Labour have long put the NHS at the forefront of election campaigns. This time, all the parties are promising increases in funding. Labour's solution is more radical, though, to unpick many of the reforms made by David Cameron. But the NHS often doesn't respond well to big structural changes, which can cost hundreds of millions, if not billions, to implement. Like with most things involving the NHS, the problems are easy to see, the solutions more difficult.
James Clayton, well, let's talk a bit about those solutions. Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, is still with us, and we're joined by the former Conservative MP and ophthalmologist, Dr Tanya Mathias, Chief Executive of the Health Foundation, Dr Jennifer Dixon, and the GP and Women's Health Specialist, Dr Shazadi Harper. Once again, the government did not wish to engage. Jennifer Dixon, if I can come to you, always when we have debates about the NHS and elections, it's all about games of poker. It's raising the money. It's who can spend most on it. But actually, are we looking at this the wrong way through a telescope?
Well, I think there are three probable things at the moment that are affecting the NHS. The first thing, for the last 10 years, it hasn't had the investment that it had previously. So that's one thing. It's had less than half the investment year on year. Secondly, there are acute workforce shortages. It's 100,000 staff vacant at the moment, 40,000 nurses, 10,000 consultants. So that has to be plugged. If you go into any NHS ward, you can see the consequence. And the third thing, there's spillover effects, because there's been total political failure to solve social care, which means a lot of frail older people not receiving any care, or when they do receive care, it's stretched 15-minute visits or whatever. The result of that is that patients then spiral into casualty, and we have seen the biggest growth in casualty attendances by people aged over 65, and it's no accident. So those three things are some of the root causes.
And we'll come on and talk in more detail about social care and integrated social care, NHS, in a moment. But John Ashworth, just coming to this centrality of money, because any family visiting any NHS facility, speaking to relatives who perhaps work there, realise that it is a much more complex problem. It's a joined-up problem. It's about technology. It's about systems. A lot of things could be done that are not simply reliant on money. Changes in the ways of working.
I mean, quite, but I mean, money is a big part of it, because as Jennifer said, the NHS has been starved of resources now for 10 years, and although the overall NHS revenue budget has risen slightly in those 10 years, other aspects of health spending have been cut back, like training budgets, and we've got a problem with chronic shortages for 40,000 nurses, as we've just heard, or public health budgets have been cut back, and of course the sister service social care, which isn't NHS but has a huge impact on the NHS, has seen multi-billion-pound budget cuts. So money is a big part of it, which is why we yesterday we announced
we were just hearing there from Jennifer Dixon about
investment.
Sorry to interrupt. We're just hearing there from Jennifer Dixon about the massive staff shortages, massive training shortages. You're going to have to get them from somewhere, and you're going to have to get them quickly. If you come to power and want to make a difference, you're going to have to get these consultants back from wherever they are in the world. You're going to have to get nurses right now, not training them over 3 or 4 years. You're going to have to get them right now to make a difference.
Yeah, but training is important, which is why we said we'll bring back a bursary. But I agree. I mean, I would not put in place hindrances on the on trusts if they think they have found surgeons and nurses and midwives from across the world who they think are qualified enough to come to our country to care for our sick and elderly. I would sweep away the hindrances that we've seen and have been put in place recently.
Well, let's talk to Dr. Harper now. You were a GP for many, many years. If you had the power, what would be one thing from what you've actually witnessed that you think should change in terms of structure, working practices and so forth?
Well, one of the things I find very strange is how there are internal markets within the NHS. We have what we call primary care, secondary care and tertiary care. Primary care is sort of GPs, secondary care is general hospitals, and tertiary care are sort of specialist hospitals like Great Ormond Street. why do we have an internal market within them? Why are we not just one care? Why do we have budgets for each one? And I think that makes inefficiencies grow. And, you know, everybody's trying to hold on to their pot of gold, as it were, or grow it. Whereas actually there should be one budget for the whole of the NHS, and we should be a one-care NHS rather than having different sort of steps and hierarchies within it.
Well, Dr. Matt, I mean, you are an ophthalmologist, you were an MP, you're not a candidate this time round. Can you see the kind of structural changes, this idea the internal market isn't working?
No. As a politician and as a doctor and as somebody that has seen people in hospital, I think the less the politicians interfere, the better. It is about the money. It is about the strong economy. It's therefore, at the end of the day, for the primary and the secondary and the specialist, is about the outcomes. Mm-hmm. And that is where we should leave it to the medical teams. We should empower them. And what will be happening, I would think, 21st century and beyond, cross-party support to empower the staff within the NHS,
but it's
backed up by a strong economy.
But it's an old system. It's come from sort of Nye Bevan's era when, you know, GPs didn't want to become GPs within the NHS, so they were given the chance of having their own practices, and they were small practices. So I don't understand why it happens this way.
And Nye Bevan didn't in 1950.
So we're in the 21st century now. I think we need a more joined-up care process.
So, one of the major problems, and some shocking statistics which came out of the King's Fund, is that the levels of sickness and mainly stress mental health issues affecting NHS workers are above the average in the economy, far above the average in the economy. Yeah. And in fact, in April, the most frightening statistic was that 1.4 full equivalent days were off sick in April.
Yes,
that is so damaging to the NHS.
This is a barometer, like today's stats show, of stress in the National Health Service. And I think if you're talking about reform of the health service, the last thing the healthcare system needs is another massive reform. Mm-hmm. It needs investment, and it needs to be left alone to be continue the improvements that it is making. The NHS over the last 10 years has doubled the amount of people going through outpatients from 60 million to 120 million. So staff can do it, but at the moment they are absolutely up against it. Colleagues will tell you,
and they staff days. If you have, sorry to interrupt, but if you have staff off sick, it doesn't just mean that staff person's off sick. It might mean an operation is cancelled. Yes. It might mean there cannot be discharge. It might mean that there's different treatments that are not available. It might mean that there's not chaperones. Yes. The knock-on to the rest of the health service itself appears to be sick. John Ashworth, what about what we're hearing here in the studio from Dr. Mathias, that actually politicians just get out of the health service, leave the clinicians, leave the managers to structure it the way they want it?
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't want to be in the way of clinicians, but I think one of the problems we've got, and all of those who are interested in health policy are grappling with, is that the Conservative Liberal government, introduced the famous Health and Social Care Act, which created a real fragmented mess in the NHS. And when you're dealing with patients with a number of different chronic conditions now, from diabetes to hypertension to depression, you actually need better joined-up care. But you've got this very messy landscape where patients are kind of bounced around from different sort of care provider, like a kind of ball in a pinball machine. So we're all grappling with wanting to get away with that, get rid of that sort of fragmentation, but without having a disruptive disorganisation.
Let us also be aware of what is going right. Too often, and especially in the heat of a general election, we are frightening patients and their relatives. What is going right is more integration of chronic illnesses. What is going right is NHS digitisation, NHSX, which will be transformational. We have to make sure that when we get the new government, whoever it is, that there will be amazing cross-party support. Every time I spoke in Parliament on health or social care, I was tapped on the shoulder by opposition people saying, I agree. There is so much that we agree on going forward.
But if you look at in Scotland, social care is integrated, and you can see that actually working. Nobody is discharged from hospital unless a care package is in place if they need it, and so forth. But social care is a massive issue, especially with an ageing population.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, absolutely. And I think, we need to sort of acknowledge that.
For example, I think you talked about going with your father and having different waiting times.
Yeah, so it was to an ophthalmology outpatient,
not
actually.
Mine.
No, not
not
yours.
Mine.
And I took him along, and there we were. We parked in the car park. Then we went into outpatients. First, he got seen by somebody, a healthcare professional, to have his blood pressure, height and weight. Then somebody else to have his eye test. And there was sort of half an hour, 45 minutes sort of interim in between. So by the time we got to a doctor, it was 3 to 3.5 hours. We'd been sitting there, blocking up a space in the car park. And I didn't quite understand why we were having so many little strands to his appointment process. To me, it seemed inefficient.
Jennifer Dixon.
Anyone using the NHS will see inefficiencies. We polled the public, 40% see waste. But I think what the issue is at the moment is the NHS is under such pressure that it's very difficult for staff to take a step back, to take time out, to look at the whole pathway and say, why does a patient need 15 steps to have care instead of 2? So until we can solve that, until we can invest in skills and time and space, we can't have the fast innovation that we need.
John Ashworth, let's just take a different tack on this. Do you think it is time to actually have a Royal Commission on the NHS and agree to abide by the findings of that Royal Commission? So essentially what you're doing is you're taking away from politicians, you're allowing clinicians and experts to do this, and social care would be involved in that, and then it would not be this political football that it always is in an election. Would you support a Royal Commission?
No, I'm afraid I wouldn't, because I think that sort of kicks a lot of these big issues into the long grass. And actually, what is it actually going to tell us? It's going to tell us that we need to get the funding correct. It's going to tell us that we need to get the staffing issues correct, and it's going to tell us that we need to get better joined up care. So we sort of know what we have to confront. We just need to get on with it. And the point about it being used, politicians making different arguments about the NHS, well, this is when you're spending over £150 billion worth of public money, and our constituents are raising their concerns about the state of the NHS, then us politicians have a responsibility to respond to that. Like, the Mirror tonight, I've got a story about a gentleman, a World War II veteran, 99 years of age, was left on a trolley for 10 hours. The public are going to be very upset and angry about that.
And I'm sure it's not for want of the
quite
hospital
rightly
trying
have to
their
voice
best.
that anger.
Jennifer.
Yes, I don't think we need a Royal Commission on the
They will
National
expect
Health
politicians
Service.
to speak out.
I don't think we need a Royal Commission on the National Health Service. I think what we do need is some movement on the disgraceful failure that is the lack of social care, that we fail to fix that. And some of the reason why we see the figures today is because social care is too threadbare and there are spillover effects on the National Health Service, which we're saying that is where there needs to be political unblocking. There's been a disgraceful failure over the last few years. The problems have been staring the government in the face, and there has been no solution.
Social care is the priority.
Of course it is, and this is again where we have consensus politically, and I don't want people to be frightened during this election. Yes, with social care, it is, and I think it's your foundation, Health Foundation, that said only healthcare is only 10% responsible for a population's health. And sometimes we think it's all about the NHS social care. It is about the economy. And if we get a strong economy, that is what is going to happen. For the social care crisis to come, if we don't have a strong economy, number of 85-year-olds will double. The number of working age in the next 10 years, 2%. That's what we're dealing with.
Where are we going to get the doctors from? Where are we going to get the nurses from? At this moment in time, the workload on a GP is so immense. You know, they are stretched to the limits. You know, I've seen it change in the last 10, 15 years that I feel I'm doing 1.5 days working in a day. No GP works 5 days a week. They can't sustain it. It's unmanageable. So I think the most any GP would do is 4 days a week. And that would be full time.
Thank you all very much indeed.